Good morning. Welcome to the garden. Thanks for making us a part of your Sunday activities. And what a glorious first Sunday in May it is. I almost said June, wishing time away. Don't want to do that. You know, whenever a traffic accident occurs, the police officers come and they try to interview as many people as possible to get a big picture of what actually happened at the accident. That's because everybody has his or her own perspective on what has occurred. And so it's important to put all of those together in order to figure out what really happened. For example, the driver would have one viewpoint, a passenger might see it some other way, an eyewitness, an onlooker might have experienced it a different way, and somebody coming behind or coming toward it might have seen it in a very different way. And so it's important to gather all that information if we want to know what really happened, what really goes on when an accident like that occurs. Well, it seems to me that maybe the same thing is true for us whenever we have any kind of conversations or experience a life event or have any of those things happen, because we see it a certain way. And I think our general tendency is to believe that that's the way it is. That because we see it that way, that's really what's real, that's what's true. But I think probably we have our own filters here. Someone has said, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And I think that's really accurate. That's because we do all have our filters. We do have blinders. We're products of our upbringing, of the values we hold, of the experiences we've had, and all of that comes together and causes us or allows us to see in a certain way, and we begin to think that that's all there is, and that's the right way and the only way. Now, it's important for us to realize that there are many other perspectives out there. And when we look through our lens, it may be a little blurred or it could be distorted in some way. And we need to try to get a bigger picture, the full picture there. Now, some of us may remember back when Stephen Covey put out his first book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And in that book, he talks about an exercise that he first experienced when he was at the Harvard School of Business. The professor brought this picture that's just about to show up on screen and showed it to the class and asked them what they saw. And they disagreed on what they saw in that picture, and he was trying to help them understand that they could see different things and both be correct, even though they disagreed on it. Now, let me ask you, what do you see there? An older woman, a younger woman, what do you see? Both. Good. Because it is both. It's really both. It depends on how we look at it. And it's not a logical thing, it's more of a psychological phenomena that causes us to do that. So it is a matter of trying to see that there are other ways to look at something, other ways to understand things. I think that's a good thing for us to remember, because sometimes we think that our way is the right way and the only way. And sometimes it's helpful to have a different perspective presented to us. Say, for example, we have a problem that we're trying to solve and we don't seem to be getting anywhere. It might be helpful to ask someone else to look at this particular issue or problem and see what they might suggest, how they might go about doing it. The same thing's true when we get in the habit of doing certain things a certain way. It gets beyond our imagination to think that there could possibly be another way to do that. And yet sometimes if somebody points out or shows us a different way, it might be more efficient, maybe more appropriate. And so it is important to try to give ourselves a little leeway and try to look at things differently, see a different perspective there. There's a whole series of photos that's been going around the internet that shows things sort of from a bird's eye perspective, rather than the way we typically see things at ground level. For example, there's this picture. That's Venice and its collection of canals there. That looks far different from the air than it would being on eye level, on ground level with it. And then there's this one. Those are the tulip fields in the Netherlands. It's a beautiful image of what goes on there, but we wouldn't see that image if we only saw it from one perspective, from the ground level. And then there's this one. It's one of the great pyramids of Giza. And it too looks far different than it would look if we were looking from the sands of the Sahara Desert. So it's important for us to think about that, to be open to the possibility that there are other ways to see things than the way in which we see them. Now, when I thought about that, what came to mind for me was something that I had read in a book by Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky entitled Leadership on the Line. And their point was that when we're in the midst of action, in the midst of the fray, if you will, we can't always figure out what's going on. We can't always understand it. They wrote these words: "Great athletes can at once play the game and observe it as a whole, as Walt Whitman described it, being both in and out of the game. Jesuits call it contemplation and action. Hindus and Buddhists call it karma yoga or mindfulness. We call this skill getting off the dance floor and going to the balcony, an image that captures the mental activity of stepping back in the midst of action and asking, what's really going on here?" You see, sometimes we're in the midst of things we cannot see, so it's important to look from a different angle, to look from a different perspective, and we'll see something that perhaps we wouldn't see any other way. Well, the Bible passage for this morning may be addressing this topic at least a little bit. It's from the Message, and it's from Matthew's Gospel, and it's attributed to Jesus as part of a collection of sayings and teachings that he offered to those who followed him. And let's look at it, and then we'll try to decipher what it's saying. "Your eyes are windows into your body. If you open your eyes wide in wonder and belief, your body fills up with light. If you live squinty-eyed in greed and distrust, your body is a dank cellar. If you pull the blinds on your windows, what a dark life you will have." Now, usually when I prepare a message and get into studying the Bible passage, I will look at what other commentaries say about this. I didn't find anybody to say the way I'm taking it, so it may be valid, it may not be valid, but I'll tell you the way I understood this particular passage. When it says, if you open your eyes wide in wonder and belief, your body fills up with life. If we open our eyes and try to see, say through the eyes of a child, where everything is filled with wonder and awe, then that's light, that's openness. It's being more open to things. If, in fact, we shut it down in whatever ways we choose to do that, by ego, by arrogance, by pride, by any number of things, if we shut it down, we're closed. We're not willing to look another way, to see something else. And it's dank, it's dark, as it's described there. I really think this passage is about trying to develop within ourselves a more grace-filled and graceful and generous spirit toward those who have a different viewpoint, who have a different perspective. It's a matter of realizing that if we become a bit more open, we too may see things in other ways, in different ways, and that there's not just one way to do it. You see, you and I sometimes get entrenched and we think, this is the way it is, this is the way I see it, and this is right. And this world's too big for that. There are too many different perspectives that we can have. And so how do we go about opening ourselves to those and seeing some of those other perspectives? When we do that, it changes a lot of things. One of the ways it changes is that we become more approachable. Because we seem more open, people are more willing to interact with us in a different way. Margaret Wheatley put it like this: "Our willingness to acknowledge that we only see half the picture creates the conditions that make us more attractive to others. The more sincerely we acknowledge our need for their different insights and perspectives, the more they will be magnetized to join us." Well, how do we get to that point where we can be more open, we can really try to see with a different set of eyes and see in a whole new way? Sometimes maybe it will take a crisis or some trauma of some sort. It's like an article I read about an NBA player, and speaking of the NBA, I've been chastised for 2 services for not saying "Go Pacers" at the end of the service, so get ready, we're going to do it today, all right? I forgot it both times. Actually, I didn't forget about it. It just didn't occur to me. So we'll remedy that this service. Okay, now back to the topic. I read about this NBA player who was a point guard for the Celtics. And his name is, I'm not sure I have this right, but Rajon Rondo. Does anybody know? Am I close? Okay, good. That's what we're going to call him. He has been an all-star. He's a star on that team. Well, in January of 2013, he suffered a torn ACL. It meant he had to have surgery and go through a year of rehab in order to come back and be able to play basketball again. He did his rehabilitation in Florida, and he said it turned out to have served a dual purpose for him. Yes, his body, his knee got rehabilitated so that he could go back to playing the game of basketball again. But he also said that it gave him the opportunity to take a fresh perspective of himself and new understandings about what life meant to him and what it was all about for him. And he began to think about his identity and realized that, yes, he was an NBA player who played basketball, but that's what he did for a living. That wasn't all of who he was. It was only part of who he was. When he did recover and was able to get back to the game, he said this: "You appreciate life more. You appreciate the game more. You don't take the game for granted every day that you wake up and get to play this game and step on the court." He had a change of perspective because he saw it a different way. He saw his life and his world a little differently as a result of it. So sometimes, hopefully not always, but sometimes it takes that kind of thing to give us a diagnosis, will cause us to see things differently, to have a whole new perspective on life. But hopefully it doesn't take something like that. Maybe sometimes it's just a matter of detaching ourselves from the familiar. Maybe it's going on vacation and going to a totally different place than perhaps we've ever been before. And when we're there, we'll discover that that's a different rhythm of life for us, and it puts us in a different mindset, and we see it a little differently, and we develop different understandings. Now, obviously, we can't always go on vacation to get that change of perspective, but there are things we can do to remove ourselves from the things we normally say and normally do. Maybe it's taking a walk in the woods, and we can see something totally different when we do that. Alexander Graham Bell talked about that this way. He wrote, "Leave the beaten path occasionally, leave the beaten track occasionally, and dive into the woods. Every time you do so, you will be certain to find something that you've never seen before. Follow it up, explore all around it, and before you know it, you will have something worth thinking about to occupy your mind. All really big discoveries are the results of thought." Well, isn't it interesting to put ourselves in a different setting, in a different scenery, in a different piece of environment, and see what we find, what's new there. And that does open us up and helps us be more creative. There's yet another way, I think, that we can begin to try to gain new perspectives and understand that there's more than one way of seeing the world and ourselves and life in general. And that's by really making sure that we get to know someone who's of a different culture, a different tradition, a totally different background from us. We are so fortunate these days, it seems to me, to have such a diverse society. There's incredible richness there, and we can learn so much from getting to know someone who has a very different viewpoint from ours, who has a different understanding of what the world is all about and what life's about. And it certainly has a way of opening us up and helping us perhaps come to new understandings and maybe even embrace new perspectives for ourselves. Now, obviously, the ideal would be for us to be able to go somewhere and immerse ourselves in another culture, but most of us don't have that opportunity, at least not very often, and not in to the same degree. But when we do that, we do begin to see that there's other ways to see things. There are other ways to experience life and the world. But the second best is to get to know someone from a different culture, from a different background, and to try to maybe see through other eyes and see what we can understand now and how we can understand them in a way that perhaps we haven't before. You know, as I think about this, it really seems to me that this is really a faith issue. It's about trusting. It's about trusting God enough and trusting ourselves to allow ourselves to think differently, to experience things a little differently, not fearing that we're going to change, but instead welcoming and inviting in those new perspectives and more openness so that we can begin to see things different ways. I know it's a risk, but I think it's a risk worth taking if we can develop a new perspective.